My name is Vincent Barletta, and I'm a professor here at Stanford in the Department of Iberian and Latin American Cultures. I also have the pleasure of serving this year as director of the Abbasi program in Islamic Studies here at Stanford. Tonight's event on faith and democracy is part of our year-long event series on Islam and American politics, a series that we hope helps our broader community to develop a deeper, more complex understanding not only of Islam, but also of the United States. In 1994, American philosopher Richard Rorty somewhat famously described religion as a quote-unquote conversation stopper, and thus an impediment to the healthy functioning of a democratic society. For Rorty, democracy is rooted in conversation, linked less to tradition than to experimentation and new customs and institutions. As he puts it, when a speaker defends a given political stance on the basis of religious faith, she or he is essentially putting an end to conversation and initiating an argument that can lead to all manner of horrors, as Rorty puts it. I'm not here to dispute this point, as in American politics, religion has often enough been used as a tool to choke off meaningful reform and to prematurely put an end to open and open-ended discussions of what it means to realize this country's immense potential. The idea that underlies tonight's event, however, is that religion, like democracy, is also an ongoing conversation, and that this has always been the case. Our speakers tonight will talk about the democratic roots and impulses within four of the world's most significant faith traditions: Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Each member of the panel will make a brief statement, and then our moderator will ask them questions. And afterward, our panelists will take questions from you, the audience. Our moderator tonight is Robert Gregg, Emeritus Professor of Religious Studies at Stanford University and author of several books on the rituals, institutions, and thought of early Christianity. He is also the founding director of the Abbasi program in Islamic Studies. And we have tonight with us four distinguished panelists. I'll go in order of how they're seated. To Professor Gregg's left, Mohammed H. Fadel is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto, where he teaches courses on Islamic law and the liberal state, among other themes. Apart from his law degree, Professor Fadel also holds a PhD in Near Eastern languages and cultures from the University of Chicago, where he wrote his dissertation on legal process in medieval Islamic law. Rebecca Lyman is Professor Emerita at the Church Divinity School of the Pacific, an Episcopal theological school within Berkeley's Graduate Theological Union. Professor Lyman has also taught at the University of California at Berkeley and has published several books and articles on early Christianity. Professor Richard Madsen is the Distinguished Professor of Sociology at UC San Diego. Professor Madsen is author and co-author of no fewer than 12 books on Chinese culture, American culture, and international relations. He has also written scholarly articles on how to compare cultures and how to facilitate dialogue among them. His most recent book is titled Democracy's Dharma: Religious Renaissance and Political Development in Taiwan, published in 2007. Stephen P. Weitzman is the Daniel E. Koshland Professor of Jewish Culture and Religion at Stanford University. He specializes in the Hebrew Bible and the origins of Jewish culture. His recent publications include The Jews, A History, published in 2009, Surviving Sacrilege, Cultural Persistence in Jewish Antiquity, published in 2005, and Religion and the Self in Antiquity, published also in 2005. I'm thrilled to welcome our guest here tonight, as well as everyone who has shown up to join in this conversation. I now turn the floor over to my colleague, Bob Gregg, and invite everyone to enjoy tonight's event, which is generously co-sponsored by several Stanford organizations: the Jewish Studies Middle East Fund, the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies, the Department of Religious Studies, and the Stanford Humanities Center. Bob?
Thank you, Vincent. If at any point you cannot hear what the speaker is saying tonight, just wave your hand and that person will move the microphone closer to himself, herself. I hope most of you have had the opportunity to see on Sundays on CNN Fareed Zakaria's Global Public Square. I am channeling Fareed Zakaria tonight in my introduction. We have a great panel tonight, 4 renowned scholars of particular religions, each of them capable of widening and deepening what our session's title suggests. Each will make an opening set of observations, promote some theses, cases in point. I'll ask them to consider each other's points and viewpoints in as much detail and candor and even criticism as they choose after each is finished, after they have all finished. And at the end, there'll be an opportunity for all of us to put our questions to them. So let's get to it. The order in which our panelists will speak is alphabetical by the religions that occupy their scholarly time. So Richard Mattson, you shall begin.
Thank you very much. This is a wonderful pleasure to be here. I'm a sociologist, and I talk about this mostly from the point of view of sociology of religion, but also of politics. Okay. Is this better? Okay. The first thing to know about Buddhism is that it's enormously diverse, and so it's very, very difficult to say anything really general about it. It's very, very diverse, and Buddhists have dealt with political issues of political conflict in many different ways, depending on their context, depending on times of history. But despite all this diversity, there's some common themes that run through many of the very different kinds of Buddhism. Buddhism is not a unified institution. You know, there's no Pope of Buddhism. There's no, global Buddhist institution. It's very localized and takes different forms depending on the part of the tradition that comes out of. But cutting across that are certain kind of common themes, and the main theme, of course, is that found in the Four Noble Truths that supposedly the first sermon that the Buddha preached after his enlightenment. That the fact that the world is full of suffering or unsatisfactoriness, because even if you think you're happy now, it won't last forever because you'll get sick and you'll die and so forth, and you have to deal with that. That the suffering has certain causes, and the main cause is that you are attached to things, you desire things, want to hold on to them and so forth in a world which is constantly changing and you can't hold on to it. The way to get rid of suffering is to get rid of those desires, and the fourth noble truth is the path laid out by the Buddha about exactly how to do that. So that's the general idea. It's seen by Buddhists not as a faith. There's not a faith in God, and many Buddhists today will tell you that the Buddha is not a God. The Buddha was a man who reached this enlightenment and tried to show others how to do it. It's a way of thinking, it's a vision of life, and a set of practices to try to get to the kind of advanced consciousness that enables you to put life in perspective. So, cutting through all this, there are certain basic fundamental themes that are relevant to this issue of democracy and politics. First of all, Buddhism is universalistic. The idea is that for the Buddha, everybody has this predicament. Everybody is faced with this suffering, this impermanence of life, and so forth. And the Buddha, of course, came from India, and he was in a caste society. And what he says is that the caste is not relevant to this. High caste, low caste, whatever. Everybody is faced with this fundamental human predicament, and everybody can get out of it if you follow the right path. So Buddhism is for everybody, and everybody is at the same level in a very fundamental way. So a very fundamental idea, therefore, is that we're all equal in a most fundamental way. We have potentially equal dignity, and our dignity does not depend on accidents of where we're born, what status we're born into, and so forth and so on. So that's one big part of the theme. Another big part is that the main virtue of Buddhism is compassion. Because of this situation, it drives people to compassion, and to develop this consciousness, you have to exercise this virtue of compassion for all. And the compassion involves a commitment to basically to nonviolence. The first precept in Buddhism is not killing any sentient being, any animal, as well as any human being. So the Buddhism should spread itself through through example, through persuasion, not through forcing things on people. So commitment to violence. And then a final theme is that there are many different paths to this enlightenment, and people you should respect the different paths that people take, and you should therefore tolerate people who have different starting points than you do, and different faiths and so forth. So universalistic commitment to peace and nonviolence, acceptance of great diversity and so forth. These are all kind of themes in the tradition, which have been maintained over the centuries in different kind of forms, which I think have an important relevance, of course, to the possibilities of building and sustaining democracies today. Now, Buddhism over the centuries adapted to many different kind of political regimes, political systems. Okay? Another theme in Buddhism is the theme of skillful means. That is, you're supposed to skillfully pick the right ways to deal with particular situations, to follow this path. And that means also adapting skillfully to particular political context and so forth that you're in. In general, of course, throughout the 2,500 years, since the beginnings of Buddhism, has basically existed under monarchical regimes and has been come to terms with and protected and supported usually monarchies. In the 20th century, there's been there've been reformations in Buddhism. Reformations partly because of globalization and communication and competition with other religions like Christianity, and needs therefore to both rethink and purify and further develop certain aspects of the understanding and the teaching, as well as to purify and organize and rationalize the way in which monasteries and so forth were built and dealt with, all that kind of thing, as well as to try to find ways to kind of make Buddhism relevant to the problems posed by modernity. So in the course of this, there have been many ways in which Buddhists have begun to enter modern political life and the problems posed by modernity. You can make a distinction these days between what some scholars are calling socially engaged Buddhism, which is more directly political, and humanistic Buddhism in Asia, which is less directly political but has at least an indirect, very important influence on it, I believe. Socially engaged Buddhism, what you find, especially in a lot of places in Southeast Asia. Okay, a couple of very quick examples. I have a friend who's a human rights lawyer in Hong Kong, and he works with a man in India whose name is Lenin. And Lenin is a Dalit, a member of the untouchable lowest caste in India. And Lenin's family, for generations, have been fighting against discrimination against people in the low castes. Lenin's parents were hardcore communists. Lenin has a brother named Stalin, okay? So this is really hardcore. And they basically followed kind of a Marxist tradition to try to deal with this discrimination and so forth. But now Marxism has failed, it has lost its credibility, communism doesn't seem to be a viable path forward. So Lenin has become a Buddhist. And actually a lot of Dalits in India have become Buddhist, and they see this as a way of marking their identity and setting them apart from the Hindu majority in India, and also giving them both the courage and solidarity to carry out, movements to try to improve their situation and get rid of discrimination. So that's one. Another very important activist, kind of a passive kind of activist, is Aung San Suu Kyi, in Myanmar, Burma. And as you may know, Buddhism is a extremely important part of her life. Her main, most famous essay is called Freedom from Fear, and fear is one of those desires that Buddha is supposed to get rid of, and she talks about it in terms of this and the way in which to basically liberate yourself and liberate your people, to get rid of fear, and to therefore not be afraid to make the kind of changes that are necessary to have a better, more just society. She spends an hour each day meditating and so forth before she begins her work and so forth. And of course in Myanmar, the Buddhist monks rose up, several years ago, crushed by the government and so forth, but have taken a politically active role on occasion to try to kind of overturn or mitigate at least this authoritarian military government there. Another person, of course, the Dalai Lama in Tibet. And and Tibet's struggles for a kind of independence or at least self-determination over against the Chinese, Han Chinese control. In all those cases, in most of these cases at least, a common theme though is basically peace and nonviolence. That is to say, people like Aung San Suu Kyi and the Dalai Lama are preaching nonviolence, that they want this social change, they want to be assertive and so forth, but they don't want to do it by killing people in a violent kind of way. They're willing to suffer the consequences of standing up and getting beaten down rather than using violence to try to overthrow things. And that's a very common theme in Buddhism, the need to get engaged in social change, but the need to do it in a nonviolent kind of way. And they're pushing for change, and the ultimate goal is something that would lead to a greater kind of democratization in their respective societies if and when they could achieve it. In a place like Taiwan, in northern parts of Asia, the kind of Buddhism that's becoming very socially consequential is what people are calling this humanistic Buddhism. And its main theme is that the way in which you sort of escape this world is to enter this world. And Buddhists shouldn't try to kind of seek some otherworldly salvation, but to basically enter this world and to make this world a good world through making it more compassionate, more loving, and so forth. And there are many different ways of trying to do this. The groups I studied in Taiwan are trying to do that partly through education, meditation, et cetera, and very, very importantly by getting people engaged in trying to help people in need of all different kinds in a very open, energetic, tolerant way. The one group I studied sees this as part of Buddhist education. You raise your consciousness, not just by reading books, but by basically pushing people beyond their comfort zone to try to help other people that they normally wouldn't want to help because they're not part of their families, not part of their neighborhoods, they're strangers, even enemies. And so they've gone out of their way to help people in mainland China, which of course is a mainland conflict with them, North Korea. They've been to Rwanda and Kosovo and Iraq, help rebuild a hospital in Fallujah after the U.S. Marine Corps blew it apart. And everywhere, including the United States. And they've been helping people in Hurricane Katrina and so forth and so on. So part of it is reaching out and expanding your kind of compassion muscles, as it were, and helping see the world in a deeper light. So Buddhists are trying to do this for changing consciousness and doing so in a way of pushing people to be more open and compassionate and so forth. In a place like Taiwan, most of these Buddhists I talked about don't want to be involved in partisan politics as an official Buddhist community. But it's very important, but what they're doing is creating the kind of habits of care, compassion, mutual responsibility, and so forth, which I think are an important part of a fledgling democracy like Taiwan, because they provide some of the social solidarity and social caring and responsibility to make people good citizens. And keeps a society like Taiwan, which just made a very recent transition to democracy from blowing apart, because there are many centrifugal forces there. But there's a foundation of social capital, of care, concern, and so forth. And part of that, and a very important part of that, has come from the Reform Buddhist movements who are trying to do that. So Buddhism doesn't have a political philosophy. It doesn't talk about ideal political institutions, but it creates certain kinds of cultures, certain kinds of ways of interacting and awarenesses of the world, which I think are different, politically relevant, and actually can provide a very, good foundation for a viable, ongoing democracy.
Thank you very much. Rebecca Lyman.
Thank you. I'm supposed to explain all this in 10 minutes, so as a historian, I've broken it down into two ways to look at Christianity, relation of Christian faith to democracy. And the first part of that is to ask, which Christianity are we talking about when we talk about democracy? And the second one, especially in this context here at Stanford and in an election year, is to talk about democracy and Christianity in the United States. and how that's perceived, and how we can look at that historically in terms of this sense of an American and Christian exceptionalism, and as well as this growth of a civil religion, which has emerged in the United States, which gives a kind of utilitarian value to values and to religion as part of American democracy. So first of all, when you want to think about democracy, you want to say, which Christianity are we speaking about? Because within the different branches of Christianity, there are different structures of authority, different constructions of individual conscience or faith within those structures or community. And therefore, while all Christians embrace revelation, Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, and Protestantism, these are the three groups that I'm using, find it in different places. So for example, Scripture alone for Protestants can value community, but also value individual conscience and dynamism, particularly within American Protestantism, through the Great Awakening, through various other forms, have been quite dynamic. Versus with Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism, looking at Scripture and tradition, looking at a much more hierarchical idea of authority, even though individual conscience is still important within that tradition and understanding. Over the centuries, these forms of Christianity, therefore, have adapted to various sorts of political structures. So we've started in the imperial courts of Rome and Constantinople. Eusebius, for example, saw the emperor as the embodiment of the word, the logos, has a role within society. Augustine gave us the city of God, in which there's clear demarcations between sort of God's process in history and what politics might be up to, so that we have a tension going on in history. Then we have the local tribal kings of Western Europe with the anointing of authority and the role of the church within that, more monarchical structures, to the merchant cities of the Reformation and Renaissance, to the revolutions and republics of the modern era, which have embraced socialism, capitalism, and democracy. So, in other words, Christianity has a flexibility to it, which has allowed it to be a part of a different types of political societies. I want to say that this flexibility, I think, has to do something with the early history of Christianity and about Christianity itself, which first of all, Christianity was apocalyptic and felt itself not long for the world and had very little interest in political structures or values, was uninterested or disobedient to them in terms of martyrdom, and that seed persists in Christianity. Second, as Christianity emerged very slowly as an independent movement away from Judaism, it defined itself as a universal movement and as a non-ethnic movement. So it began to create communities of various different peoples. So in place of a usual geographical center, which would be typical of ancient religion or ethnicity, the core of Christianity became these communities. This was the place of ongoing religious life, and these were named in neutral languages. Ecclesia simply means assembly in Greek. Bishop simply meant overseer. It wasn't a particularly sacred language. It was a utilitarian language in the original structure. The structures of Christianity, therefore, were both hierarchical and charismatic. There was a persisting instability within these communities with this apocalyptic idea, this kind of set-apart idea, as well as a kind of functional way to organize and control this kind of diverse assembly of individual converts. You've got a universality going on as well as an eschatology in these places. This gives you this complexity, which I think you've seen worked out in these only three branches of Christianity that I was mentioning tonight. You have a reception of an alternative, radical vision of equality and transformation. This kind of universal gathering in the name of Jesus and transformation, collecting and valuing assortments of people, not necessarily based on a certain ethnicity or place. And then eventually we would say the hallowing of that community itself. The community becomes the place. So you could say the church becomes sacred, the community becomes sacred, and leaders are set apart to serve and to guard this community, which has become this place where the Spirit and the revelation dwells. And the apocalyptic energy, as we've seen in history, gets transferred into cultural transformation and mission, which drives this kind of universality, this energy of Christianity to go out and convert and draw people into this community. So Christianity can be both radical and conservative. It can be the city of God. It can also use the state for the idea of persecution. It can rebuke kings. It can anoint kings. It can own slaves and also be part of the abolition of slavery, defend the divine right of kings, and declare the Bible as the guardian of democracy. It can institutionally speak truth to power, and it can be that conservative power itself. So it has had that sort of multiplicity of sides to it when we look at history. Now, looking at the United States, I think what I want to do is try to make American Christianity strange to us, perhaps because it has such many assumptions about what Christianity is within the United States. And I simply want to remind you of the fact that the colonization of North America by Anglican dissenters who brought Calvinist ideas about human equality, which included limited monarchy and a political commonwealth. They came in the middle of the English Civil War, if you recall, ended up executing a king, which was a huge move forward in terms of constitutional monarchy and equality of persons and the sort of response to tyranny. This created some seeds of American culture and created a complicated relation to the eventual revolutionary democracy of the founding fathers. So we had their Enlightenment values, which was in response to the religious wars after the Reformation, moved toward no establishment of religion, religious liberty, and saw religion as a private opinion to be best kept out of social interaction as a response to the wars of the Reformation, wanting to establish a liberal free state to institutionalize human will. So a free state resting on natural law and human will. But there was still this common ground with regard to the dissenting tradition of Christianity, which came with the Calvinist tradition and individual conscience, and also the idea of community and Republican values. So you have things coming both in reaction to Christianity and also inheriting some commonalities from Christianity. Two sociologists describe this as the twin tolerance of Protestant establishment and democracy. A twin tolerance of the Protestants' establishment tolerating the creation of this rational liberal state, and the state itself seeing the value of this kind of Protestantism. What was found in common was pluralism, that in the United States you had a variety of Christians with no dominant established church. You had to embrace a pluralism in terms of Christianity. And Christians had to get along. We think of Roger Williams and the arguments for freedom of religion among Roger Williams and the Baptists. The idea of community practices, and most of the mainstream Protestants would have communities of presbyters, some kind of community value, not necessarily the hierarchical idea of bishops, which would echo some of the community ideas of democracy and the republic. In the early Calvinists, there's an attention to civil society, the importance of the transformation of the world, which would be shared by democracy and responsibilities of citizens to civil society, the importance of education and reading, the Protestant devotion to literacy in order to read the Bible, and the importance of education would be values, again, which would be shared in these early communities. And finally, of course, we know from Weber, economic energy, right? Working and getting ahead in terms of market. Twin tolerance meant that in American culture, the separation of church and state could allow cooperation over common goals and values without compromising particular values of each. And so we have this kind of tolerance, uneasy relationship coming into conflict at certain times. We think of the abolitionist movement as a moment in terms we have tremendous religious energy around the issue of slavery and the transformation of society, which in the present day came into the civil rights movement which came out of ideals of equality and unity. And we also have conflicts in terms of, say, public education, which was supposedly to be non-sectarian, which appeared that way to the Protestant establishment, but not to Roman Catholics or to Jews in terms of what was taught in public schools, what stories were taught in public schools. So for the last 100 years, that had become a battleground in terms of what was the content or practices within public education. The whole issue of the social gospel is another type of reform that came out of religious movements at the late end of the 19th century, settlement houses, care for the poor, Roman Catholic positions on labor unions in the 20th century has been this kind of push towards certain social policies within democracy. We would say now that there is a reciprocal estrangement. If we had a twin tolerance, we would say there's perhaps now a reciprocal estrangement from what was seen as this idealized vision of this kind of mainline Protestant view of American democracy. And this has arisen, of course, in terms of increased religious pluralism within the United States and the decline of the Protestant establishment. I think this is our first Supreme Court, right, that doesn't have a Protestant on it. I'm not lying awake worried about it, but it's an interesting fact in terms of American history. And I would say this increasingly strengthens state neutrality, which again, going back to public education. And we still have ripple effect over prayer in public schools. But this idea of enforced, a much more enforced state neutrality than had probably been previously in practice. So we see tensions now, and I think we see them, as I said, and we can talk about this later in terms of the presidential campaign of this reciprocal establishment that obviously there are certain religious positions which are not voted on, right? They are revealed, they are accepted. They're not something that are going to be changed by popular vote. We have the pushback as well in terms of Reinhold Niebuhr, who was very critical of, say, liberal Protestants of the early 20th century, who had totally sold out to American culture or to political culture, and were not critical enough in terms of the gap between government and Christian ideals. So what we see then is, I think, this development, a continued dynamism within the United States having to deal with the growth of democracy and the role of Christianity within this, that increased religious plurality has created a different atmosphere for democracy and created a different sense of Christianity as well within our present situation.
Thank you very much. Mohammed Fadl.
Thank you. I guess I'll use this mic. I come at these questions primarily from the perspective of political philosophy and liberal political philosophy in particular. And so I really appreciate the quote from Richard Rorty that Vincent started off our evening, because we teach that text in my religion and liberalism seminar. And so I'd like to begin by thinking about that. I think Rorty's position about religion as a conversation stopper reflects to a large extent the assumptions of many non-religious citizens of the United States or liberal citizens or secular citizens of the United States, that religion is by definition a conversation stopper. And I think this concern about religion's role in political decision-making goes back at least as far as early modern political philosophy, for example, John Locke, in which he complains about people who are unable to make a good argument for position and instead then making appeals to revelation as the basis for adopting a certain political policy. And so what this sort of tells us is that political philosophers have this generic concern that religion has the potential to subvert democratic decision-making. Democratic decision-making has its own notion, has its own ideals, namely that we will engage in a process of collective deliberation, usually and there's some version of rationality there, and so that we attempt to persuade one another as to where the common good lies. And there's a certain confidence that if we all act sincerely and as good citizens, right, and we use our deliberative powers to further our common enterprise of common citizenship, then we will arrive at a decision that is consistent with the public good. And the liberal story of religion is that religion subverts this process, because instead of furthering our common deliberations, it instead makes appeals to premises that are beyond the normal reasoning powers of human beings, and instead requires us to defer to the views of a charismatic figure, right? And so clearly that conception of religion is highly problematic from the perspective of democratic theory. But what I'd like to say is I don't think that that is necessarily an accurate view of all religious reasoning. Much religious reasoning, in fact, is transparent, is based on reason giving, and is perfectly willing to engage in the kind of give and take deliberation that is characteristic of really vibrant democratic discourse. And at the same time, this kind of authoritarian reasoning that philosophers like Locke were concerned about, that religion introduces into the public square, is not a vice that's exclusively associated with religious reasoning. Non-religious reasoning can also become dogmatic, closed, unwilling to accept criticism, and unwilling to accept or to engage in a culture of reason-giving among equals that is characteristic of a democratic society. So I would like to challenge this idea of religion being a conversation stopper and say that a failure to give a reason is a conversation stopper, not religion. And so ultimately what we need to be concerned about are political arguments that do not or are unwilling or incapable of giving reasons to justify their positions, but instead rely on power, right? They rely on their dominant strength in society, whether by virtue of culture or money or other types of privilege, to impose their views on society without having to engage in the normal kinds of justifications that we would expect in a society of equals. Now, with respect to Islam in particular, I'm a specialist in Islamic legal history, particularly Sunni Islam, and I think here is the tradition of Islamic law, I think, is highly consistent with a culture of mutual reason giving. Islamic law as a legal tradition does not have a kind of charismatic authority that exists to resolve disputes. The only kind of authority that exists within Sunni Islam is a discursive authority, meaning it's based on the power of arguments. And so leaving aside various substantive doctrines, I think what's important to take away for the perspective of the relationship of Islamic law as a culture to democratic culture is that they have in common a certain commitment to reason giving as fundamentally constitutive to legitimacy of positions. And I think that's a very important virtue that we want to cultivate in all of our citizens, whether religious or non-religious. So in this case, I think the tradition of Islamic law has a very positive role to play. Now, I think it's also important to understand that democracy is not a thing. Democracy is a process. From the perspective of political philosophy, we can speak about what we consider the essential attributes of a democratic society, but in so doing, we articulate an ideal that, by definition, is not empirically present. And so I think what we can talk about reasonably is that we can speak of certain states manifesting an example of being closer to a democratic ideal, and other states being further from a democratic ideal. Even the most authoritarian states will contain democratic elements, and even the most progressive democratic states will contain elements of authoritarianism. And I say this because I think it's very dangerous to equate the normative ideal of democracy with any particular regime, because that can lead to a certain kind of triumphalism and exceptionalism, which can then be used to justify all forms of nasty violence and wars against other states that are excluded from this status as democratic. And ironically, the appeal to these democratic exceptionalism to justify war may in turn be the very reason why other societies get stuck in certain cycles, or certain non-democratic cycles. Right. Now, different Islamic traditions, I think, have different relationships to the ideal of democracy. So we can say, much as there are different states, we can talk about a range of democratic practices that exist in various states, from less to more. I think we can say the same thing about various Islamic traditions. Some traditions are more democratic, are more consistent with democratic culture, other traditions less. Again, I specialize in Sunni Islam, and I think Sunni political theory, there's a highly developed, in my opinion, conception of legitimate politics in Sunni thought. And I think that conception has the germ, a very well-developed germ of the basic idea of democracy as government being representative of the people. That is, I think, the fundamental idea of Sunni Islamic political theory, that government exists as an agent to further the ends of the political community. At the same time, however, the people is understood as a religious community. And because they are a religious community, that creates certain limitations, both positive and negative, on what the state can do. So the state must do certain things, right, by virtue of it being a religiously defined polity, and at the same time it must refrain from certain things because of its commitment as a religious state. And so that means, I think, that the problem, at least from the Sunni perspective, is not democratization as such, meaning in the sense that the people participate in government, but rather it's a question of how you define the people so that it includes people who are non-believers. Right? Now, I think I've already touched on the point that there's a certain tension inherently between the democratic ideal and religious ideal. And so institutional organized religion can exist in relationship that's, a tense relationship with democracy, insofar as institutionalized organized religions create an alternative locus of loyalty for citizenship. Likewise, religion can create some sort of tension because particular teachings of religion might conflict with particular decisions of a democratic society. But I think the deeper problem is when we're talking about a religion, an organized religion, that inculcates a culture of extreme deference to authoritarian leadership, of a charismatic kind of leadership, in which the followers of that religion are discouraged from ever engaging in any kind of autonomous questioning, rational deliberation, and instead are expected to simply defer. Those kinds of, qualities are highly problematic from the perspective of democratic citizenship, which requires, or at least holds as an ideal, autonomous participation in governance. So I think my time is up, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen Weissman.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm going to just make one brief academic comment, and then I will speak to this issue from my own personal experience as a Jewish American. The title of our program is Faith in Democracy, and that I stumbled over that title because the word faith doesn't work well when we think about Judaism. Faith, for a lot of us, conjures up an image of kind of inner state, a state of belief or of personal religious experience, something that's private, a matter of conscience, of individual conscience, whereas democracy is public and political. Framing things in that way makes it possible to distinguish faith from politics and even to think of them in opposition to one another. Whereas for Judaism, as I know it, religion and politics have always been intertwined. They're really inseparable from each other. And there's a great example of that in the holiday the Jews are observing right now, the holiday of Passover, which is a religious experience, but it's one about an act of liberation from tyranny and the experience of redemption that Jews talk about when they observe Passover. It's not some kind of otherworldly redemption where the soul goes on to another world, but redemption in the here and now, and redemption not for an individual, but redemption for a community. So in Judaism, it's hard to talk about faith as distinct from politics. They're always interconnected. But there's still the question of how religion and politics interconnect. And that's a complicated question, in part because Jews have lived in so many different kinds of political contexts. They've lived in monarchies, they've lived in empires, they've lived in theocracies, they've lived in socialist contexts, they've lived in democracies. And Jews have adapted to all those different political contexts. I study a first century Jew by the name of Philo of Alexandria, who lived in the first century, and he speaks about the Roman emperor the way I spoke about Obama in 2008. He just thinks the Roman emperor is the ideal political ruler, and that there is no better form of governance than the Roman Empire. So Jews have adapted to empire, they've adapted to monarchy, and the question is, what is the relationship between Judaism or Jews and democracy? And so here's where I want to speak from my own experience as a Jew, acculturated within a democratic context. And I want to use Passover as an example again. So growing up as a kid, observing Passover, that experience reinforced for me a lesson that I got in all kinds of ways, and that is that not only were Judaism and democracy compatible, they were basically the same thing. I was raised to believe that Judaism is an essentially democratic faith, and my experience of Passover just reinforced that. It's a story, after all, about how the Jews were liberated from slavery, from bondage in Egypt, and how they made their way from that state of servitude and oppression to a state of freedom, a promised land. And the promised land, as I imagine it, was suspiciously like the United States of America. The songs that we were singing during Passover, many of them were traditional Jewish songs for that holiday, but we were also singing songs from the Civil Rights Movement. This was in the 70s, and we were singing "Let My People Go" and other songs that were taken from the Civil Rights Movement. Only I didn't realize they were taken from the Civil Rights Movement. I thought these were traditional Jewish songs, and it was just a coincidence that the Civil Rights Movement was also singing them. And that just more signs of the fundamental incompatibility. And for those of you who have ever been at a Passover Seder, at least in America, they are themselves a very democratic experience. They're very participatory. Everybody participates, from the elderly to children. There's lots of discussion, and it just seemed like an intrinsically democratic experience. And finally, I brought a little prop. This is the Passover Haggadah that I read from as a child. A Haggadah is a kind of script that Jews follow during the Passover meal. And this is a version of that script that was produced by the Maxwell Coffee company, which began producing these in the 1930s, and has since then produced 50 million copies of this Passover Haggadah. And it, of course, tells the story of the Exodus, the Israelites wandering from the wilderness. And you read Hebrew right from left, so it begins on this side. And as you make your way through the Exodus story, you finally reach the end. And what's at the end? It's an advertisement for various Maxwell coffees, right? So for me, growing up, the Exodus story culminates with the abundance of personal choices that one has in American capitalist society. So I was really raised to believe that. And I'll confess, I still believe that Judaism and democracy are fundamentally compatible. And that was borne out, that impression was borne out by the experience of the Jewish communities the major Jewish communities that existed as I was growing up. The American Jewish community, where Jews flourished as a culture. Israel, which was a vital democracy. We were aware of the challenges of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the complications that ensued, but we were also very proud of the fact that Israel was a vital democracy with a very open, vital press and an independent judiciary and all the rest. And so those were signs that democracy was the right political context for Jewish culture. And the third major Jewish community at the time that I was growing up was the Jews in the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. And those Jews were languishing, they were persecuted, and they yearned to be free. And so comparing that experience of the Jews in the Soviet Union with the experience of Jews in American Israel, it was very clear to me that democracy was the right politics for Judaism, and the only context in which Judaism really could flourish as a culture and religion. So that was like what my experience as a kid, and I kind of still believe a lot of that, but growing up and becoming an academic, I realized that things weren't quite so simple as I realized, and that it took a lot of work to produce a Haggadah like this, a lot of negotiation between two different very cultural traditions. And so what I want to use the few minutes I have left to kind of emphasize are some of the tensions between Judaism and democracy that I've discovered since my childhood. One, of course, is just the fact that Judaism was not conceived in a democratic context. Democracy for Jews is a modern experience. It's something that Jews have only known for the last 2 centuries or so. And for most of Jewish history, Jews have lived in non-democratic societies. And all the texts and traditions that kind of are the foundation for Jewish culture, or many of them, I should say, not all of them, but many of them were developed in non-democratic settings. The Bible was developed in a monarchic cultural setting. It imagines God as a king, and the society in which it was composed was a monarchic society. And so the monarchy affects kind of the formulation of Jewish tradition. That monarchic kind of context affects Jewish tradition in many ways. And the other kind of foundations of Jewish tradition, the Talmud, the Haggadah itself, they were all composed in non-democratic context, and that non-democratic legacy continues into the present. And a great example of that has to do with gender, right? A democratic society, men and women are supposed to be equal, right? But Judaism was born in a patriarchal society where men and women were not treated equally. And so there are Jews to this day who struggle between the democratic ideal of gender equality and the kind of more traditional pre-democratic inheritance of a patriarchal society. So that was one source of tension. A second source of tension is that it turns out democracy, although very good for Jews, hasn't been completely good for Jews. There's some ways in which democracy has actually been bad for Jews. Jews with democracy, of course, acquired freedom. They acquired self-empowerment. They were able to control their own destiny in a way that they had never been able to do when they lived in non-democratic settings. And when they found themselves with the power to choose their own destiny, a lot of them chose not to be Jewish, or a lot of them chose not to be religious. I remember my own grandfather, very anti-religious, really resentful of the way in which he had been compelled as a child to behave in certain ways, and really was very antagonistic toward it. And that was part of Jewish emancipation, was not just the emancipation from anti-Semitism, but emancipation from religion. And so a lot of American Jews today are secularized. They don't want to be religious. They don't want to be controlled by religion. And that's a challenge for the Jewish community. Will it survive when so many of its members want to assimilate to the mainstream culture? And the third and final challenge, of course, is the empowerment that has come with the State of Israel. Right? For most of their history, Jews have lived under others. In the 20th century, they found themselves in control of their own society. And the modern State of Israel and Zionism have presented a new set of tensions between Judaism and democracy. What to do, for example, with the non-Jews who live within the Jewish state. What to do with the relationship between church and state within a Jewish state. These are all very, very, very difficult issues that persist in Jewish culture now because of the modern State of Israel. And I have no idea how they're all going to get resolved, but they are exacerbating the tension between Judaism and democracy in ways that were not the case before the establishment of the modern State of Israel. So I think what I'm sensitive to now that I wasn't sensitive to when I was a kid is that there are tensions, real tensions between Jewish tradition and democratic tradition. But what I'll say finally is that those tensions, although a problem, are also a source of vitality. They're part of what sustains Jewish culture today as a vital culture, and ultimately, despite the tensions, I think most Jews today would agree that democracy is good for the Jews. So thank you.
I think it's all right to applaud this group after their four presentations. We appreciate chiseled presentations which really marked out differences between positions of the religions you're representing tonight and democratic processes. I want to, before we open this matter to general discussion, I'd like to ask each of you, or whoever wants to speak, to say something about the current scene in the United States during an endless election year or two, about what you find the most intriguing. I won't give it a positive or negative value. What you find most intriguing in intersections of religion and religious values and democratic values on the current scene, maybe a particular instance or even a personality in that person's platform or position or whatever. Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, I just want to say Obama was actually the first president ever to observe a Passover Seder in the White House, so I appreciate that.
Well, I think we were talking earlier of Santorum's criticism of Obama's bad theology. And what struck me was it was unfortunate. I mean, in terms of the sort of American history of religious pluralism of trying, and particularly with the ecumenical movement, trying to sort of Christians to get along, much less everyone else, just to get Christians to get along is a huge accomplishment. So it's sad to me to see in this election year in democracy, divisive Christian arguments being brought into the public arena, as if we didn't have enough things to disagree about. We don't need to keep disagreeing about, intra-Christian identities. But I mean, clearly, that's one of the interesting things about this race is the religious test that's being applied now to presidential candidates in a very explicit way, in terms of, what degree of Christian are you? And then not even to open it up beyond that, the assumption still being that there has to be a Christian presidential candidate, and then the Christian test within that, I think for me, is a pretty discouraging development within the political scene.
Oh, I live in Canada now, so I think I'll punt on commenting on American politics.
How does the U.S. election season look?
Very scary. I'm being 100% serious. I think Canadians are really quite shocked and dismayed, and actually quite happy to be a few miles north of the border.
Richard?
Like Rebecca said, I think, ecumenism is dead. When I grew up, I was a Catholic. We were very interested in ecumenical movement, reaching out to people of other faiths and so forth and so on. This was a big thing. And now it seems it's gone, and no holds barred, and there are disputes among different religious positions in the public sphere as well as everything else. And I think the kind of political discourse we have now is more contentious than I've seen in a long time.
But on the other hand, there's signs of progress. I mean, Mitt Romney, his Mormonism has obviously been an issue in this election, and obviously it's impeded evangelical enthusiasm for him, but he is going to be the Republican presidential candidate. Mm-hmm. And the idea of a Mormon as the Republican presidential candidate suggests that we are making slow progress toward religious inclusivity.
Mm-hmm. If I could just follow up on that point. I actually think the media exaggerates the kind of religious fanaticism that exists in the United States. It's a good story, the news cycle is slow, and it gives credence to people who are not credible, and I find that to be really disturbing. I never thought for a minute that Michelle Bachmann could be a credible candidate for presidency, but yet I think the media made her into one. Same thing with Santorum. And unfortunately, there's just this very strange dynamic with the way the primaries work and low turnout, et cetera, that magnifies the voices of people who I don't think represent the median American, or at least I don't think so. I hope not, right? And it gives a false presentation, I think, of America to people overseas. It also, I think, distorts our political discourse and poisons it in a way that effectively, I think you could talk about creating a heckler's veto for certain kinds of groups because it exaggerates their strength. Politicians are not known for their courage, right? And they overestimate the strength of the fanatics, basically, I think.
Let us open this conversation to you. Any comments or questions?
The question was, when will the United States have a non-Christian president?
Who wants to answer?
Gosh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make light of it, right? But I don't know. That's a really good thing to think about. It wouldn't surprise me to be that won't be too far away.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yes, please.
Well, before I ask a question, I just want to make a statement that pertains to my questions. I do believe all religions and faiths are wonderful. They just get all screwed up when humans enter the picture. With that, I want to direct a question to the gentleman at the end. That end. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. You talk about the state of Israel and Judaism and democracy, and you call the situation between Israel and the Palestinians as tensions. To me, as a Palestinian American, this is complete brainwashing. And you talk about democracy and Israel in the same sentence while completely sidestepping how an entire society of native Palestinians have been deprived for 65 plus years out of their basic human rights and needs inside this so-called only democratic state in the Middle East. So how do you comment?
Is that a question?
Yes.
Exactly what are people applauding for exactly? I don't get it. There are tensions. I wasn't talking about the tension between Israelis and Palestinians. I was talking about the tensions that are felt between Judaism and democratic ideals. And I'm not saying that those tensions are being resolved successfully or not. I'm saying that Israelis feel committed to both. And you can judge them as hypocritical, but the Israelis I know are actually committed to both traditions. Now, how to connect or how to resolve that contradiction within Israeli culture is the defining question of Israeli culture today. So I wasn't trying to weigh in on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't think it's fair to characterize my comments as brainwashing. And I only wish that more cultures in the world felt the tensions between their indigenous religious traditions and democratic ideals.
Hi, my name is Muhammad Ali. I am a second-year student in the law school. And I'm wondering if the discussion of faith and democracy is misguided. Because, faith means so many different things to different people. Am I theologically a Muslim? Is that my political identity? Is that my cultural identity? So I don't really see the complexity, in the thesis that faith and democracy are compatible. I mean, I don't think any rational religious person is going to say, oh, I want to live under a tyrant. So, I guess my question is, by posing discussions like this, are you really, are you creating more harm than good? Because to me, the underlying implication of the title of a talk like this is that they are incompatible, when in actuality, it might be more useful to take a more anthropological perspective, where you view cultures and nations in context, with a full view of how colonialism has affected political structures. Because to me, that's kind of the elephant in the room. To say, well, are Islam and democracy are compatible? I mean, there are 1 billion Muslims in the world, and you can get a lot of different answers. So to turn that into a question, to what extent is this question even like a productive discussion?
Well, I don't know if it's productive or not, but it's a stock question in the tradition of political philosophy, liberal political philosophy. And I think in American constitutional law, it's a fundamental question. That's why you have the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And the problem with an anthropological perspective, not that I'm against anthropologists, some of my best friends are anthropologists, is that it doesn't give us any normative criteria, right? So I'm a lawyer. You're studying to be a lawyer. Law is very normative, right? And so we have to make decisions about whether laws are legitimate or illegitimate. And we need some criterion for doing so, right? And anthropology can't give us that. And so in a democratic society, right, there are multiple versions of democracy. I happen to subscribe to a certain kind of Rawlsian idea of democracy, and that provides a basis for judging whether certain laws are legitimate, right? And I don't think we can evade that. So it might be nice to think of, well, we should really be thinking circumstantially and contextually and things like that. But at the same time, at the end of the day, every society needs to develop some norms of legitimacy. And I agree that maybe the norms of legitimacy for mitigating, for determining a legitimate law in society A could very well be different in some respects from society B. But in the US has its own particularist history as well, just like certain colonized countries have had their own particularist history. And our particularist history happens to come out of religious warfare, right? And one of the products of that is the First Amendment. That's an important artifact of our particular history, right? And I think there's certain normative ideals that are reflected in our tradition of jurisprudence that go beyond that particularist history. But we can't avoid ultimately abstracting from various different particularisms to something more general, or else we can't really have a democratic society at all, right?
So if I can follow up, I guess the implication of my question is when you use the vocabulary of the conflict between faith and democracy, in my mind, that translates politically into we need to spread democracy in the Middle East. And that leads to we invade a country. So I'm not talking about the US, I'm talking about when we view other cultures and other countries.
Well, I think I was quite clear about the danger of democratic triumphalism, right? But on the other hand, you could just as well have a symposium on finance and democracy. I mean, finance is equally potentially subversive of democracy. I mean, I don't think there's anything inherently dangerous about, the binary faith and democracy. I mean, I think we should be sophisticated enough to understand that, you can have mutually reinforcing and sometimes conflicting relationships, and it's not just religion. It can, like I said, capitalism. I think capitalism is much more of a danger to American democracy than religion.
How can we imbue more of the Buddhist religion or beliefs into the other religions?
Live in California.
Actually, I think, at least for all of these, what's necessary is really, you know, dialogue among religions of all kinds, and kind of a mutual learning. That's much easier said than done. But I think the hope, such as there is, lies there. And you know, Karl Jaspers, the philosopher, historian, talked about sort of axial age and breakdown of civilizations and reconstitution, partly through new religious insights 2,500 years ago or so. And he says now, you know, we're in the middle of a new crisis, basically. You know, we've had technologies and so forth that are fantastic, but no kind of spiritual development that enables us to find a way to live together without just raw power of one kind or another. And this is a global problem, and its solution, on its solution depends the fate of the earth, maybe, right? But the only way to do that is not by imposing one faith on anything else, but through some sort of a dialogue to reach various kinds of common senses of the common good. And whether that's possible or not, I don't know. But I don't see any other way forward.
Thank you for the conversation. I appreciate it. I think it's good to have this conversation. My point is that I think democracy and religion, as gentleman Steve said, there's no difference. I think if you are having a democracy, you should be able to practice any religion that you have. So basically, if you look back at Islam and during the Prophet Muhammad, basically he asked people to vote. He never became the leader of the country or the group on its own. He actually had a process that they voted for him. And for almost 1,400 years ago, which was very unknown to anybody, people actually, they accepted him as a leader. The first few years when he became a prophet, he was not the leader of the country, let's say, as if you consider the country Saudi Arabia. And then after a few years, he became the leader after they voted for him. And 1,400 years ago, women had equal vote in Islam, and he respected women's vote and men's vote, regardless if they were from any background, black or white, or any other even religions. They had the right to vote. So I think in this country,
You must make a question.
Okay, well, question or comment, unfortunately, I think. But I guess my question maybe would be why even in this country, the religion of even a president or individuals is a question, or it can be, you know, discussed. Why, even if people criticize Obama, even if he was a Muslim, what's wrong? Why is that a criticism of the leader to be Muslim, Christian, or Jew? It can be anybody. And why are we even questioning his religion?
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think the reason is we have two different ideas of the American polity. There's one idea that views it as a historical community that traces its lineage back to, you know, certain Anglo-Saxon immigrants from England that were Protestant, et cetera, and that's what it means to be an American. So if you're not part of that that's sort of like, I guess, the nationalist conception of America, right? Then there's another conception which is much more liberal, views membership in the American community as political, as being defined by the rights and obligations set out in the Constitution. And of course, from a purely constitutional perspective, it's totally irrelevant what anybody's religion is. But lots of people in the United States have a kind of culturalist gloss on the Constitution. And that's really the fight. I mean, those we call the cultural wars, right? There's some people, you know, who think that America is about the political ideal. Others think of it as this continuing cultural tradition going back to, you know, the English settlement.
Okay, thank you, professors, for the wonderful presentation. My name is Yan Shuo. I'm a second-year PhD student from the East Asian Languages and Cultures Department. I'm really touched by all the talks about the interconnectedness of different faiths, and I believe that you know, in this age of globalization, it is very important to emphasize our commonality instead of constantly focusing on our differences. And so I found this conversation really relevant. And I guess the question that I have is, in order for all the different faiths to have a dialogue, should we get rid of the differences? How should we, is it possible to establish like a social or academic institution where we can have a more regular conversation and sort of face the human problems together in an interreligious context? So,
I don't think you can or should, even if you could, but I don't think you can get rid of the differences, okay? I think what's an issue is talking, across our differences, and looking for confronting common challenges. Common challenge of the environment, ready to be destroyed, the possibilities of world peace, very fragile, and we can talk about that even from different points of view and reach some common ground. But I think I'm for keeping the robustness of different faith traditions, because I think they all have potentially a lot to bring.
I think that, I just wanted to say, I think there are a number of interfaith groups that United Religions is one, groups that meet and have dialogue, and I think that, we're feeling kind of pessimistic, but I think in fact there's been quite a lot of progress in terms of this kind of interfaith and ecumenical cooperation than there used to be, and part of that is embracing plurality, of seeing what is in common and respecting and learning from one another rather than wanting to dominate or whatever. And I do think that is one of the gifts of democracy and freedom of religion, is recognizing the existence and the vitality of that within a common culture.
Hi, no pressure, right? I'm afraid the law school is overrepresented this evening. I'm also a second year, but I wanted to ask the question. We know that charismatic capture of the body politic is really not limited to religious discourse. We saw that observed earlier this evening. And I'm bearing in mind the frustration with democracy in the early 20th century that led to the rise of fascism in Europe in particular, and concerned about the level of punditry that we now experience on TV right now and sort of the decline in public discourse. So I was wondering, partly also with relation to religious discourse in this country as well, do we see an increased role for religious education and improved religiously educated conversation in the public sphere? Obviously, you all think there's something productive to having this kind of talk to some degree. I'm wondering your view on that.
I mean, I think I would welcome a more elevated religious discourse in the public sphere, but I would also welcome a more elevated conservative discourse in the public sphere and a more elevated liberal public discourse in the public sphere. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. The culture of TV punditry, I think, is really corroding the quality of public discourse. It's the mixture, I think, of profit in the media, combined with our cult, the cult of the star, that is turning our politics into sort of, it's just another form of like professional sports entertainment, and I don't think it's helping improve our discourse. I mean, the idea of elections is that's a time when citizens gather and are supposed to be deliberating for their common good, and instead of improving our political life, it actually mars it and tarnishes it. So one's depressed during political campaign season more than anything else. So I'm very worried actually about the future of the United States based on the kind of stuff that's coming out recently. I mean, every election cycle it seems to go from bad to worse. So I don't know how, somebody's got to put a stop to it. I don't know how though.
And my question is actually to the Buddhist person. Was there any time that Buddhism was the dominant or ruling religion in a state, and what did it lead to? Because I know that all the others, yeah.
Well, for instance, in China during the Tang Dynasty, Buddha was basically the state religion. Actually, the Tang Dynasty in China, that was from about 600 to about 900 AD. It was one of the times of the greatest cultural flourishing, actually, of China, openness, cosmopolitanism, and so forth, although there were its share of political intrigues, and Buddha's monasteries got too rich and, corrupt and so forth and so on. So usually when religions get hold of power, they start to get corrupt, and this is really common, okay? In Buddhist, history, the king Ashoka, about 2,300 years ago in India, he was a monarch. He's seen as an ideal one. He actually killed a lot of people to become king. But then after he was king, he became Buddhist and devoted himself to peace and tolerance and so forth, and has all these inscriptions about how important it is to have an open tolerance on a society. And he's seen as an ideal ruler without talking about how he got there. There are good rulers, bad ones. Power tends to corrupt, and it's really best, I think, that if any of these religions don't become dominant and get caught up in the corruptions of power.
Thank you for coming out tonight, and let us thank again our panelists.